When fans say this keeps happening, are they exaggerating? Or are they tracking something real? This video looks at how fans of JoongDunk and Dunk Natachai began documenting patterns involving their agency, GMMTV, not through speculation, but through timelines, screenshots, and comparisons over time. This is not an accusation. It's not a verdict. It's a chronological breakdown of what fans noticed, what they recorded, and why frustration slowly escalated. Not from one incident, but from repetition. This isn't about favoritism. It's about consistency. Before the hashtags, before the open letters, and before anyone started talking about patterns, there was already a context fans were operating in. By 2025, JoongDunk and Dunk Natachai, often referred to together as JoongDunk, were not newcomers. They were an established pairing with an active international audience, multiple ongoing projects, and a fandom that was highly organized, digitally fluent, and used to tracking schedules, content drops, and engagement metrics. That fandom calls itself JoongDunk. What matters here is not the name itself, but how the fandom operates. JoongDunks are not passive viewers. They archive posts, compare timelines, track filming cues, and notice when expected updates don't arrive. This isn't unique to them. It's how modern fandoms function, but it becomes important later because it explains how patterns were noticed, not just why. One thing also needs to be made very clear. Everything discussed in this video happens within a single year, 2025, not across a decade, not across multiple management eras, within one continuous production and promotion cycle under GMMTV. Early in the year, fans were already observing signs of strain. Jung and Dunk were juggling overlapping commitments, filming schedules, promotions, rehearsals, events, and preparations for upcoming projects, often running in parallel rather than unfolding in clean stages. Projects didn't pause to make room for one another. They stacked. Some productions moved unusually fast. Filming timelines were compressed. In certain cases, shooting and airing overlapped. There was very little buffer, no margin for delays, reshoots, or unexpected changes. At the time, none of this was framed as mistreatment. In fact, most fans interpreted it as normal industry pressure, demanding but manageable. Being busy was seen as a sign of relevance and momentum. What fans didn't do was react loudly. There were no protest hashtags, no mass callouts, no public accusations aimed at the company. Instead, they watched. And this is where timing starts to matter. When schedules are compressed and margins disappear, even small issues land differently. A delayed post, a missing update, a last-minute change. Not because they're dramatic on their own, but because there's no breathing room around them. At the time, fans weren't reacting emotionally. They were observing quietly. Only later, after more visible incidents occurred, did people begin looking back and realizing that many of the stress points they'd brushed off weren't isolated. They were early indicators of something repeating. This is important to underline. The backlash did not begin here. At this stage, there was only attention. And in fandoms like this, attention is how patterns begin. The first moment that clearly shifted fan attention came at the end of September. On September 29th, JoongDunk appeared at Paris Fashion Week, attending a Saint Laurent show. Almost immediately, fans began documenting the scale of the response. Mentions surged across platforms. Hashtags trended internationally. Engagement spread far beyond the usual BL audience, reaching fashion and general pop culture spaces. What stood out wasn't just that the appearance did well, it was how well it did without visible agency amplification in the early window. Fans tracked timelines closely and noticed a gap between the global buzz and the official acknowledgement from GMMTV. When the agency post did arrive later, it followed days of fan-driven momentum. Jung replied with a brief public, "Thank you." On its own, that interaction was neutral. But within the context fans were already monitoring, it landed differently. To many, it looked like recognition arriving after the fact, reactive rather than coordinated. This was the first time fans began explicitly comparing metrics versus response. The question wasn't whether Jung's appearance mattered. The numbers clearly showed it did. The question was why the amplification appeared to come primarily from fans, with institutional support trailing behind. Importantly, this moment did not trigger an immediate backlash. There were no protest hashtags yet, no mass callouts. What it did was establish a reference point. From this moment forward, fans had a concrete example they could return to when later issues emerged. Paris Fashion Week didn't create the frustration. It gave fans something measurable to compare against. And once that comparison existed, future gaps were no longer isolated moments. They became part of a growing pattern. Following Paris Fashion Week, attention shifted from a single event to an ongoing project, Dare You to Death. And this is where comparisons began to harden into patterns. As filming progressed, fans started monitoring the series' official presence more closely. What they expected was baseline visibility, regular updates, behind-the-scenes moments, cast introductions, and milestone check-ins as production moved forward. What they observed instead was long silence. Official accounts tied to the series posted infrequently. Workshop photos were limited. Filming queue updates, often referred to by fans as queue updates, appeared inconsistently or not at all. Behind-the-scenes content was sparse, and live house appearances, which fans viewed as standard promotional support for ongoing projects, never materialized. What made this noticeable wasn't just the absence itself, it was comparison. Other shows under GMMTV, at similar stages of production, were visibly active. Frequent posts, cast-focused content, and repeated live house coverage. Side by side, the difference was easy to track. Fans were careful in how they framed this. The argument wasn't that Dare You to Death deserved special treatment. It was that it seemed to be missing the same baseline promotion others were receiving. This is where the language begins to shift. Instead of asking, "Why hasn't anything been posted yet?" fans started asking, "Why does this keep happening here?" The Paris Fashion Week delay had already introduced the idea of reactive amplification. Now, with an entire series progressing quietly, that idea felt less isolated. By this point, no hashtags were trending. There were no coordinated campaigns, but there was documentation, screenshots, timelines, and side-by-side comparisons, and a growing sense that the gap wasn't accidental, but structural. At this point, the question stopped being when will updates come, and became why the baseline wasn't the same. As the official promotion for Dare You to Death remained limited, something else quietly began to happen. Content didn't stop appearing, it just stopped coming from official channels. Instead, updates began coming directly from the actors themselves. Jung shared casual behind-the-scenes moments, short clips, set photos, small, low-effort posts designed less for polish and more to give fans something to engage with while production continued. At first, this didn't raise alarms. Actor-led posting is common, especially in the early stages of a project. Fans often appreciate it. It feels personal. It feels generous. But over time, a pattern emerged. The more Jung posted, the clearer it became that these updates weren't being echoed, amplified, or structured by official accounts. In many cases, the series account wasn't originating content at all. It was reposting what the actor had already shared, or staying silent altogether. This dynamic was later reinforced by comments from within the production itself. A co-actor described Jung as someone who consciously posts during filming so fans have something to trend, rather than waiting for a series to air. The intention wasn't self-promotion for its own sake. It was momentum, keeping the audience engaged when official updates weren't coming. That detail mattered to fans. Because once that context was visible, the issue stopped being about missing posts and started being about responsibility. Promotion wasn't just lagging. It was being informally outsourced, absorbed by the people already carrying the workload of filming. Fans weren't criticizing Jung for doing this. Quite the opposite. They praised the effort. But they also started asking a quieter, more uncomfortable question. If actors are filling the promotional gap themselves, what role is the system meant to play? And this is where frustration deepened. Not because fans expected perfection, but because what looked like generosity from the artist began to feel like compensation for something missing upstream. At this stage, there was still no mass backlash, no trending tags, no open letters. But the shift had happened. Promotion was no longer something fans were waiting for. It was something they were watching others quietly take on. Up to this point, fan activity had remained internal. There were screenshots, timelines, and side-by-side comparisons, but no coordinated pressure, no slogans, no mass tagging of the company. What existed was discussion, mostly contained within the fandom. That changed in early October 2025. By then, fans realized they were no longer tracking a single delay or a missed update. They were documenting the same gaps repeating across different contexts: a global fashion appearance, an ongoing drama production, and the day-to-day mechanics of promotion. This is where Escalation became organized. Hashtags began trending globally. Open letters circulated publicly. And crucially, the messaging was consistent across platforms and languages. Fans were explicit about what they were and were not asking for. They were not attacking other artists. They were not asking for special treatment. The demands were narrow and repeatable: a dedicated admin for official accounts, baseline promotional parity with other projects, and clearer, more consistent communication. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was organizational escalation. As part of that documentation, fans also pointed to moments where even basic tagging errors were handled reactively, sometimes with dismissive replies, reinforcing the sense that attention only followed pushback. They compared these moments directly with how comparable series under the same agency, at similar production stages, were receiving regular updates, live house coverage, and visible support. The contrast was no longer abstract. It was time-stamped, archived, and easily verifiable. From the outside, the backlash appeared sudden. From the inside, it was cumulative. By the time the conversation became public, fans weren't reacting to one moment. They were responding to repetition. And from here on, the consequences would no longer stay online. Until then, everything had remained online. Posts were late, accounts were quiet, communication felt uneven. Frustrating, yes, but still contained within fandom spaces. That changed when consequences stopped being digital. One of the first moments fans point to is the delay of Dare You to Death's first episode event. The postponement itself was not what triggered backlash. Fans largely understood that unforeseen issues can happen. What caused frustration was how the situation was handled. Many fans had already booked flights and accommodations to attend. When the event was delayed rather than relocated or restructured, some ended up paying twice: for transport, for hotels, for time off work. These were not casual inconveniences, they were financial losses. This is where the tone shifts. Fans weren't angry that something went wrong. They were questioning why there didn't seem to be stronger contingency planning, clearer communication, or faster alternatives when things did go wrong. What had previously felt like scattered management gaps now began to feel connected. Because once people start losing money, patience changes. At this point, the conversation moves beyond visibility and promotion. It becomes about responsibility, about whether systems are in place to protect not just schedules and timelines, but the people, fans and artists alike, who commit to them. And this is the moment many fans describe as the line being crossed. From here on, issues would no longer stay contained within posts and screenshots. They would spill into airports, event venues, and real-life experiences, setting the stage for what came next. If the moment when online issues became real-world costs marked the turning point, this was the breaking point. On December 13, 2025, fans were informed that Dunk Natachai would no longer be attending a Shilla duty-free event in Singapore. The announcement came at the last minute, with the agency citing unforeseen circumstances and naming Tae Tawan as a replacement. Almost immediately, confusion followed. Fans shared screenshots and messages suggesting that Dunk had already been awake early that morning and was at the airport, preparing to travel. At the same time, international fans were already in Singapore, some having flown in specifically for a short appearance secured through lucky draws and paid schemes. The wording of the announcement became a central issue. The explanation was vague, and to many fans, it read as if the artist himself had pulled out. Without clarification, speculation filled the gap. Later, further information circulated indicating the issue involved documentation, not health, not unwillingness, and not a last-minute decision by Dunk himself. But by then, the damage was already done. Fans felt blindsided, not just disappointed, but exposed, emotionally and financially, after travel, planning, and anticipation. What they reacted to most wasn't the cancellation itself. It was the lack of clarity, the timing, and the way responsibility appeared to fall on the artist by default. This is also where the emotional burden became visible. Tae Taewon stepped in on extremely short notice and addressed fans directly, explaining the situation, thanking them, and trying to stabilize the moment. Dunk followed with his own message, apologizing to fans, acknowledging their expenses and effort, and reassuring them about his health. For many fans, this was the moment the pattern crystallized. They weren't questioning why things go wrong. They were questioning why, when they do, it's the artists who speak, explain, and apologize, while institutional communication remains limited or absent. The Shilla duty-free incident brought everything together: vague messaging, last-minute changes, real-world losses, and artists absorbing the emotional fallout. After this, trust didn't just weaken, it fractured. After the Shilla duty-free incident, the tension didn't reset. It carried forward. In the days that followed, GMMTV resumed posting, including merchandise promotions tied to Dare You to Death. On its own, this wasn't unusual. Fans were never opposed to merchandise. JoongDunk products had consistently sold well, often selling out quickly, and fans had proven repeatedly that they were willing to support financially. What unsettled people wasn't the merchandise itself, it was the sequence. From the fan perspective, unresolved questions were still hanging in the air. There had been no clear institutional explanation addressing the Singapore situation, no acknowledgement of the confusion caused, and no visible change in communication style. Against that backdrop, monetization returning first felt jarring. At the same time, new errors began to surface. Incorrect posters were uploaded, captions mismatched images. Some posts were edited or corrected only after fans pointed out mistakes publicly, sometimes more than an hour later. Individually, these were small issues. Collectively, they reinforced an existing concern: that there was no consistent internal checking before content went live. This is where the tone of fan discussion shifted again. Earlier, fans had spoken about delays. Then they spoke about uneven promotion. Now they were talking about reliability, about why the same kinds of mistakes kept appearing around the same projects, about why corrections seemed reactive rather than preventative. Importantly, fans continued to separate intent from impact. Many explicitly stated they were not accusing individuals or speculating about motives. What they questioned was process, training, oversight, accountability. By this point, goodwill had thinned. Not because of one error, but because errors were stacking faster than explanations. And once that balance tips, trust becomes fragile. This wasn't the loudest moment in the timeline, but it was one of the most consequential, because it marked the point where fans stopped expecting clarity to arrive later and started doubting whether it would arrive at all. By this stage, one misconception kept resurfacing from the outside: that this was about anger, entitlement, or fandom drama. Inside the conversation, that wasn't how fans framed it at all. Across posts, letters, and translations, the same clarification appeared again and again. Fans were not asking for special treatment. They were not attacking other artists. And they were not denying that accidents, delays, or unforeseen issues can happen in any production cycle. What they were asking for was consistency. They pointed out that when the same kinds of gaps, delays, or errors appear repeatedly around the same artists, it becomes reasonable to question whether systems are working as intended, not emotionally, structurally. Fans emphasized that documentation was not harassment. Screenshots, timelines, and comparisons were not meant to escalate conflict, but to explain why trust had eroded. In their view, tracking patterns was the only way to be taken seriously once explanations stopped coming proactively. There was also a clear line fans refused to cross: Many posts explicitly asked others to remain mindful in their language, to avoid personal attacks, and to separate criticism of processes from criticism of people. The focus stayed on management, communication, and accountability, not character. This distinction matters because it explains why the backlash sustained itself without burning out. It wasn't fueled by outrage alone. It was fueled by repetition, and by the feeling that concerns were being acknowledged only after pressure, not before problems occurred. At this point, the narrative had shifted again. The question was no longer whether fans were overreacting. It was whether repeated documentation itself was being dismissed simply because it came from a fandom. And that question doesn't apply to just one pairing. What makes the JoongDunk situation resonate isn't just the names involved, it's the mechanics. Modern fandoms don't operate on vibes alone. They track timelines, compare outputs, archive posts, and notice when standards shift depending on the project. This isn't unique to one fandom. It's how digital audiences engage across entertainment industries now. In that context, this case becomes less about personalities and more about systems. How promotion is scheduled, how communication is handled when things go wrong, how quickly institutions respond, and who ends up carrying the emotional and reputational weight when they don't. That's why this story travels. Fans from outside the JoongDunk fandom recognize the pattern because they've seen similar dynamics elsewhere. Artists stepping in to reassure, fans absorbing costs, and explanations arriving only after pressure builds. Viewed this way, the backlash wasn't a fandom anomaly. It was a stress test, a moment where modern audience literacy met traditional management habits and exposed the gaps between them. And once those gaps are visible, they don't disappear quietly. This video wasn't a verdict. It was a record. A chronological look at how attention turned into documentation, how documentation turned into questions, and how repetition turned those questions into a public conversation. When fans stop reacting and start tracking, something has already shifted. Whether you see this as coincidence or structure, one thing is clear. Consistency matters, not just in promotion, but in trust. I hope this pause in the chaos made you think. If it did, tell me. Does this feel like a series of unfortunate mistakes, or a pattern that was bound to surface? Until next time, this is GPkP.